History has a deletion problem, not a forgetting problem, not a gradual fading of memory over centuries. A deliberate, systematic, physical deletion of entire civilizations, their records burned, their cities dismantled stone by stone, their names removed from every surface that carried them. And what makes this uncomfortable is not that it happened once. It is that it happened repeatedly, across every continent, across every era, to empires that at their peak controlled more territory than Rome ever did. You know Rome, you know Greece, you know Egypt. But there were empires that made Rome look like a regional government, empires that administered populations Rome never reached, empires that solved engineering problems Rome never attempted. And today, you cannot name them. Most historians cannot name them. In some cases, we only found out they existed because the ground started giving back what was buried in it. This is not ancient aliens. This is not conspiracy. This is archaeology, the slow, physical work of pulling civilizations back out of the soil they were pushed into. 10 empires, all of them real, all of them gone in ways that have no satisfying explanation. And at least 3 of them were erased not by time but by someone who needed them to disappear. 10. The Akkadian Empire. Before Babylon existed, before Assyria existed, before any of the great Mesopotamian civilizations that fill history textbooks had formed, there was Akkad. The Akkadian Empire was the first true empire in human history. Not a kingdom, not a city-state, not a tribal confederation, an empire with a centralized administration, a professional military, a standardized currency, a postal system, and a bureaucracy that governed roughly 3 million people across what is now Iraq, Syria, Kuwait, and parts of Iran and Turkey. It was built by a single man named Sargon of Akkad around 4,300 years ago, and at its peak it stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. It also produced the first named author in human history, a woman named Enheduanna Sargon's daughter, who wrote hymns to the Sumerian moon god that were copied and recopied for 500 years after her death. The first person in recorded history to sign their own name to a piece of writing was a woman running the religious administration of the world's first empire. The Akkadian Empire collapsed around 4,200 years ago in what researchers now believe was the first climate-driven civilizational collapse in human history. A volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, triggered a 300-year drought across the entire Fertile Crescent. Crops failed, populations migrated. The administrative structure that held 3 million people together dissolved within a generation. Here is what was deliberately erased: the city of Akkad itself. The capital of the world's first empire has never been found. Not damaged, not partially excavated, genuinely missing. Archaeologists have been searching for it for over a century. Every neighboring city from this period has been located. Akkad alone has left no confirmed archaeological trace. A city that administered the world's first empire, that housed tens of thousands of people, that produced the first named writer in human history, and it is simply not there. The leading theory is not that it was abandoned. It is that it was deliberately demolished, its stones removed and reused by the civilizations that came after it, until nothing remained above ground to find. The first empire in human history was erased so thoroughly that we cannot locate its capital. 9. The Kerma Kingdom, Nubia. For most of the period that Egypt was building pyramids, there was a civilization directly to its south that Egypt spent enormous military and diplomatic resources trying to contain. The Kerma Kingdom controlled the Upper Nile from roughly 4,800 to 3,500 years ago, a span of over 1,000 years. At its height, it administered a territory larger than Egypt, traded with civilizations across sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean, and built a capital city called Kerma that housed tens of thousands of people around a massive religious complex called the Defufa, 2 mud brick structures that still stand today, the oldest standing non-Egyptian structures in Africa. Kerma was not a primitive neighbor of Egypt. It was a rival. Egyptian texts from this period describe Kerma as the greatest threat to the kingdom. Pharaohs launched campaigns against it not because it was weak, but because it was strong enough to push back. During the Second Intermediate Period, when Egypt was occupied by the Hyksos from the northeast, Kerma coordinated with the occupiers and nearly split Egypt permanently. Egypt eventually conquered Kerma around 3,500 years ago. What followed was not administration, it was erasure. Egyptian records from the conquest describe a systematic effort to remove Kerma's cultural identity, its religious practices suppressed, its administrative language replaced, its ruling class absorbed or eliminated, its history rewritten as a chapter in Egyptian expansion rather than a story in its own right. It worked. For 3,000 years, Kerma was known only as a vague geographical reference in Egyptian texts. The civilization that rivaled Egypt for 1,000 years was reduced to a footnote. Excavations began in the 20th century. What archaeologists found was not a primitive culture, it was a fully developed urban civilization with sophisticated metallurgy, complex religious architecture, and trade networks stretching thousands of kilometers. Kerma had been there the entire time. It had simply been written out of history by the civilization that conquered it. 8. The Xiongnu Empire. China built the Great Wall because of them. The Xiongnu were a nomadic empire that controlled the Eurasian steppe from roughly 2,200 to 1,900 years ago, a territory that at its peak stretched from Manchuria to Central Asia. Encompassing more land than the Roman Empire at its height, they were not a tribe, they were not a raiding confederation. They were an empire with a structured administrative hierarchy, a diplomatic service sophisticated enough to negotiate treaties with Han Dynasty China as an equal, and a military that defeated Chinese armies so consistently that China's response was to build the largest construction project in human history rather than face them in open battle again. The Xiongnu extracted tribute from China for generations, not trade tribute. The Han Emperor sent silk, grain, and imperial princesses to the Xiongnu court as annual payments to prevent invasion. This continued for decades. Their erasure happened in two stages. First, Chinese historiography written entirely by the civilization the Xiongnu had dominated, framed them exclusively as barbarian raiders rather than as a functioning empire. Second, the Xiongnu were eventually fragmented by a combination of Chinese military campaigns, internal succession disputes, and a series of catastrophic winters that collapsed their pastoral economy. The northern branch migrated westward and disappeared from the historical record entirely. Some researchers believe they reappeared in Europe as the Huns, the force that destabilized the Western Roman Empire 3 centuries later, but this remains contested. What is not contested is this: the civilization that forced China to build the Great Wall left almost no written record of itself. Everything we know about the Xiongnu comes from the records of their enemies. They administered millions of people across millions of square kilometers, and we have almost none of their own words. The Great Wall still stands. The people it was built to stop have been almost completely erased. 7. The Indus Valley Civilization. This one should not be obscure. By every measurable standard, it should be as famous as Egypt. The Indus Valley Civilization existed from roughly 5,000 to 3,700 years ago across what is now Pakistan, northwest India, and Afghanistan. At its peak, it was home to an estimated 5 million people, more than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined at the same period. It had over 1,000 settlements. Its two largest cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, each housed between 40,000 and 80,000 people, making them among the largest urban centers on Earth for their time. And it solved problems that other civilizations would not attempt for another 2,000 years. Every house in Mohenjo-Daro had access to a municipal water supply and a sewage system connected to covered drains running beneath the streets. The city had public baths, standardized brick sizes used consistently across all 1,000 settlements, and a writing system that has never been deciphered. There is no evidence of a palace. There is no evidence of a temple complex dominating the city. There is no evidence of a warrior class or a military hierarchy. After 5,000 years of searching, archaeologists have found almost no weapons. A civilization of 5 million people, administering 1,000 cities, with no evidence of a king, no evidence of a military, and no evidence of war for over 1,000 years. It collapsed around 3,700 years ago. The cause remains genuinely unknown. Climate shift, river migration, epidemic, internal fragmentation all have been proposed, none confirmed. The writing system that might explain it has resisted every decipherment attempt for over a century. 5 million people, 1,000 cities, 2,000 years of urban civilization, and we cannot read a single word they left behind. 6. The Aksumite Empire. If you have made it this far, you already know this channel is not interested in the history they decided to teach you. Subscribe and stay. The next 4 entries are the ones that will genuinely change how you think about the ancient world. The Persian Empire called it one of the 4 greatest empires on earth. The Roman Empire maintained diplomatic relations with it for centuries. It was the first empire in history to put the Christian cross on its coins, decades before Rome did. The Aksumite Empire controlled the Horn of Africa, the southwestern Arabian Peninsula, and significant portions of the Nile Valley from roughly 100 to 900 AD, a span of 8 centuries. At its peak, it administered the most important trade corridor in the ancient world, the Red Sea route connecting the Mediterranean to India and China. Every luxury good moving between Rome and Asia passed through Aksumite-controlled territory. The empire extracted taxes from this trade and used them to build a civilization whose physical remains still defy straightforward explanation. The Aksumites erected obelisks called stelae, cut from single pieces of granite and raised vertically to heights of up to 33 meters and weights of up to 500 tons. The largest ever erected, the Great Stele of Aksum, weighed over 500 tons and stood 33 meters tall. It fell at some point in antiquity and broke into pieces. The second largest, stolen by Italy in 1937 and only returned in 2008, still stands in Aksum, Ethiopia today. How stones of this weight were quarried, transported, and raised with ancient technology remains an open engineering question. The Aksumite Empire declined between the 7th and 9th centuries, its trade routes disrupted by the rise of Islam across the Arabian Peninsula, its agricultural base degraded by climate shift. It retreated into the Ethiopian highlands and contracted into the medieval Ethiopian kingdom. And then it was forgotten. Not by Ethiopians, but by the Western historical tradition, which spent 5 centuries constructing a narrative of African history that had no room for an empire sophisticated enough that Persia considered it a peer. The stelae are still there, 500 tons of granite raised by people whose methods we cannot replicate, standing in a field in northern Ethiopia that most of the world has never heard of. 5. The Scythian Empire. They had no cities, they had no writing, they had no fixed capital, and for 3 centuries they controlled more territory than any empire in human history up to that point. The Scythians were a nomadic people who dominated the Eurasian steppe from roughly the 9th to the 2nd century BC, a territory stretching from the Black Sea to the borders of China. They were the first people in history to master mounted warfare, developing composite bows, stirrups, and cavalry tactics that would define military strategy for the next 2,000 years. Every subsequent steppe empire, the Huns, the Mongols, the Turks, built their military doctrine on foundations the Scythians laid. They interacted with every major civilization of their era. They traded with Greece. Greek archaeologists have found Scythian artifacts in museum collections across Europe for a century. They fought Persia. Darius the Great launched a campaign against them and was forced to retreat without a decisive engagement because a nomadic empire with no cities cannot be conquered by capturing its capital. They traded with China, they raided into the Middle East. And yet the Scythians produced no written history of themselves. Everything we know about them comes from their enemies and their trading partners, primarily Herodotus, who described them in detail in the 5th century BC. What they did leave was buried with their dead. Scythian burial mounds called kurgans have been excavated across the steppe for 2 centuries. Inside them, archaeologists have found goldwork of a sophistication that rivals anything produced by Greece or Persia at the same period. Intricate animal-form jewelry, weapons with inlaid decoration, evidence of a material culture far more complex than their absence from the written record suggests. The Scythians were fragmented by the Sarmatians around the 2nd century BC and absorbed into subsequent steppe cultures. Their name survived only in Greek and Persian texts. Their own voice did not survive at all. 3 centuries of steppe dominance, 2,000 years of military influence, 0 words in their own language. 4. The Mississippian Culture. At the same time that medieval Europe was building cathedrals, there was a city in the middle of North America larger than London. Cahokia, the capital of the Mississippian culture, sat at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers in what is now the state of Illinois. At its peak around 900 years ago, it housed between 10,000 and 20,000 people within the city itself, and perhaps 40,000 in the surrounding region, making it larger than any contemporary European city, outside of Constantinople. Its central feature was an earthen pyramid called Monk's Mound, a structure built entirely from manually transported soil that covers an area larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza at its base and rises to a height of 30 meters. It was built without metal tools, without the wheel, and without draft animals. The total volume of earth moved to construct Cahokia's monument complex, not just Monk's Mound, but the entire city's raised platform system, has been estimated at over 50 million cubic feet. The Mississippian culture at its height extended across the entire eastern half of North America, with trade networks reaching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes and from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains. Artifacts from Cahokia have been found thousands of kilometers from the city. Its cultural influence is visible in the archaeological record of dozens of subsequent Native American cultures. Cahokia was abandoned around 600 years ago. The reason remains debated: climate, disease, political fragmentation, resource depletion. When European explorers arrived in North America in the 16th and 17th centuries, the city had been empty for a century, and the forest had begun to reclaim it. The mounds were still visible. The explorers recorded them as natural hills. The largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico was mistaken for a geological feature by the civilization that built its history on top of it. 3. The Median Empire. The Median Empire is the largest empire in the ancient world, for which we have almost no physical evidence. The Medes were an Iranian people who built an empire covering roughly 3 million square kilometers, encompassing modern Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Afghanistan, and parts of Central Asia between approximately 650 and 550 BC. They were powerful enough to destroy the Assyrian Empire, one of the most militarily dominant civilizations in history. They are mentioned extensively in the Bible, in Greek texts, and in Babylonian records. Ancient sources agree they were a major power, and yet their capital city, Ecbatana, modern Hamadan in Iran, has never been fully excavated. The city has been continuously inhabited for 2,600 years, with each successive civilization building directly on top of the last, burying the median layers under meters of subsequent occupation. What physical evidence of the Medes exists is almost entirely second-hand objects found in neighboring cultures, references in other civilizations' records, a handful of inscriptions. The Median Empire was conquered by Cyrus the Great of Persia in 550 BC. Persian historiography subsequently framed the Medes as a predecessor culture rather than a rival empire, a narrative device that reduced a 3 million square kilometer empire to a prologue for Persian greatness. It worked so completely that today, most people who have heard of the Persian Empire have never heard of the empire that preceded it, equaled its territory, and was destroyed by its founder. 2. The Tiwanaku Empire. At an altitude of 3,850 meters above sea level, higher than most aircraft cruising altitudes in the ancient world, a civilization built a city that administered an empire stretching across Bolivia, Peru, Chile, and Argentina for over 1,000 years. Tiwanaku sat on the southern shore of Lake Titicaca in what is now Bolivia and existed as a major urban center from roughly 200 to 1100 AD. At its peak, it administered a population estimated at between 500,000 and 1.5 million people across an empire, covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, doing so at an altitude where the human body operates at roughly 70% of its sea-level oxygen capacity. The engineering at Tiwanaku is in some respects more difficult to explain than the pyramids. The site contains stone blocks weighing up to 130 tons that were quarried from sources across Lake Titicaca, meaning they were transported over water and then raised to altitude. The precision of the stonework at Tiwanaku's ceremonial center, the Kalasasaya, matches anything produced in Egypt or Mesopotamia. The site also contains evidence of a sophisticated raised field agricultural system called Suka Kalas, capable of producing crops at altitudes where modern farming is considered marginal. Using a network of raised planting beds and water channels that regulated temperature through thermal mass, Tiwanaku collapsed around 1050 AD in what researchers now believe was a prolonged drought that destroyed the agricultural system. The population dispersed. The city was abandoned. Within 2 centuries, the Inca Empire rose in the same region and incorporated Tiwanaku's ruins into their own mythology, claiming them as the work of gods rather than predecessors. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century and found the ruins, they asked the local population who built them. The answer they received was, the gods, before the sun existed. A civilization that administered half a continent from the roof of the world was converted into mythology within 500 years of its collapse. 1. The culture of the Cucuteni-Trypillia. The largest settlements on Earth 7,000 years ago were not in Mesopotamia. They were not in Egypt. They were not in China. They were in Eastern Europe, and almost no one has heard of them. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture existed across what is now Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine from approximately 7,000 to 5,000 years ago. At its peak, it built settlements that housed between 10,000 and 15,000 people, the largest human settlements on Earth at the time, predating Mesopotamian urbanism by over 1,000 years. These were not villages. These were proto-cities, with planned layouts, multi-story buildings, specialized craft production, and populations larger than anything that existed anywhere else on the planet. They also did something that no other civilization in history has been documented doing at scale. Every 60 to 80 years, they burned their entire settlement to the ground and built a new one on top of it or nearby. Not destroyed by enemies. Not abandoned to decay. Deliberately, systematically burned every structure, every object, every surface, and then rebuilt. Archaeologists have found these burn layers consistently across hundreds of Trypillian sites. The burning appears to have been ritual, a civilizational reset built into the culture's operating system. Their population at peak may have reached 1 million people. Their settlements covered areas comparable to cities that would not appear again in Europe for another 3,000 years. They had sophisticated ceramic art, evidence of early proto-writing, complex religious iconography, and agricultural practices advanced enough to sustain massive populations on the Pontic steppe. They disappeared around 5,000 years ago. The leading theories involve climate shift, soil exhaustion from intensive farming, and pressure from incoming steppe populations from the east. There was no conquest, no sudden collapse. The culture simply dissolved, its people absorbed into successor populations. its settlements buried under millennia of subsequent occupation, its contribution to human history almost entirely erased from the record. The largest city on Earth in 5000 BC was in Ukraine. It burned itself down every 70 years by choice, and until the 20th century, no one outside Eastern European archaeology knew it existed. That is not forgetting. That is something closer to erasure, slow, structural, and very nearly complete. 10 empires, every single one of them real, every single one of them verified by physical evidence sitting in museums, in the ground, or in the academic literature right now. The question is not whether these civilizations existed. The question is why the version of history most of us were given had no room for them. Rome did not happen in a vacuum. Greece did not invent civilization. The story of humanity is not a straight line from primitive to advanced. It is a cycle of peaks and erasures, of cities rising and burning, of empires dissolving into the soil they were built on. The next video goes deeper. Which of these 10 surprised you most? Leave it in the comments. The answer tells you something about which parts of history you were never given access to.